Just a quick reminder that registration closes the 31st. So make sure if you haven't registered that you register and that you get your rooms. I will add the registration link here shortly in the chat. And now I will turn this over to our current president, Creighton Webb.
Wandelise, thanks so much. And thanks all of you for joining us today here live. And of course, we're recording this session. So this is a great opportunity with the 101s for folks who are driving to Victoria or on their way to the conference to take a listen as well. It's a fantastic primer. First and foremost, I want to thank our conference chairs, one of whom you've already met or seen, Wandelise Turner. I also want to thank Michael Barton and Laird Duran for their leadership. A special thanks to Jesus Garza, who's the city manager from Victoria, who will be our host here in a couple of weeks and has held a new role that we haven't had at least in some time, which is honorary chair, only because his duties as city manager are as such. But boy, has he brought it and then some, and we're ever so grateful. As always, I want to welcome the alums who are part of this as part of our Year of the Alumni with the Lyceum in particular. Johnny Sutton, class of '06, grateful to you as always. Johnny has been an honorary alumni chair for 2 of our 5 meetings this year, and then now is participating in this. Before I introduce our host for the day, let me just say, as part of our campaign for civility, I think this is just a fantastic topic to end the year with. There's so much in the news as it relates to law enforcement and what they're dealing with on a daily basis, as well as tough questions. No one is better positioned or experienced to pose some of those questions than my classmate from the class of 2018, Andrew Romero. Andrew is a career law enforcement officer, last with the Austin Police Department. He is a person who never stops learning and continues to go back to school to pursue higher education. He's also an entrepreneur, and he is perhaps one of the most well-read and most thoughtful people that I've had the pleasure of ever interacting with. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce our honorary alumni chair for the Victoria meeting and our host and MC for today's 101 session from the class of 2018, Andrew Romero. Andrew.
Thank you so much, Creighton, for those very kind words, and thank you for your guidance as we have worked on this meeting. It has been an amazing experience, and so today, one of the things that we wanted to talk about today was, one, the evolution of how we got to where we are when it comes to the laws related to use of force, and I couldn't think of anybody better to assist me in this conversation today than Luis Soberón and Johnny Sutton. Let me share my screen real quick. Can everybody see my screen? I apologize for the technical difficulties earlier, but I'm grateful that you're all here now. So Johnny Sutton is a partner of the Ashcroft Law Firm and former U.S. Attorney for the Western District. He has had an incredible career dealing with these issues of police use of force and all of the matters in the courtroom related to that. Luis Soberón is the Senior Policy Advisor for the Texas 2036, and he's here to give us a primer on data related to crime and police use of force in Texas. So today's conversation will be 3 parts. One, some data related to criminal justice in Texas, and then we're going to have Johnny talk about how we got to where we are with use of force, and then I'm going to talk about some recent use of force that was controversial in the state of Texas here in Austin, and we'll kind of apply what we learned in the first 2 parts and use it with these practical real-world examples. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to Luis Soberón, who's going to give us a presentation on data.
All right. Hey, good afternoon, everyone. I am going to kind of lightning round through these slides so that we can get to what I think I'm excited to hear from Johnny and Andrew talk about use of force myself. But I wanted to cover a few things when it comes to data on perceptions of public safety and the use of force, starting with kind of our framework, how Texas 2036 thinks about law enforcement issues. We view public confidence in law enforcement as a public safety strategy in and of itself. When the public is more confident in law enforcement, they're more likely to report crimes, to call 911, to cooperate with law enforcement when they come knocking to try to investigate and solve crimes after the fact. So public confidence perception, in other words, is a big deal. So I'm going to share some results from a recent voter survey that we conducted at Texas 2036, showing that Texas voters feel safer in their own communities than in Texas cities when we ask them. I'm going to talk about how the reliable or unreliable use of force data, how it's sparse, but how it lets us know that use of force is a rare event. And then I'm going to end with a very quick overview, and I've got some studies I'm going to share with Andrew for a Dropbox link later on what the high quality research suggests about paths for reform down the line. So if you haven't seen it, I encourage you to go take a look at it. We just released our 9th Texas voter poll. We asked over 1,000 Texas voters questions about policy, politics. Too many questions to cover in the time that I've got allotted, but one that I'll highlight is we asked voters what they think about candidates when we told them about various policy positions. In other words, are you more or less likely to support a candidate that holds these positions? We asked about candidates who hold a position that they want to ensure that crime leads to arrest and prosecution. And maybe unsurprisingly, about 72% of Texas voters said that they'd be more likely to support a candidate who holds that position. In the crosstabs underneath this, there was consistency in the expression of increased support, but it varied a lot. It was a lot weaker among younger voters like the Gen Z and young millennial voters, as well as Democrats compared to Republican voters. But also you can see kind of in this ranking list, it didn't rank as high as healthcare prices or property taxes or water infrastructure, but still nonetheless something that voters care about. One of the more interesting questions that we asked, I think, was we kind of split our samples. So 50% got one version of this question and 50% got another. For the first group, the X group, we asked whether or not, or how concerned they were about crime in their community versus another group, how concerned are you about crime in Texas cities? And you can see the split here. There is, everyone's concerned to some degree, but the intensity of that concern is bigger when we're asking about Texas cities. So they're more concerned about crime in the cities, those are quote unquote, than they are about their own community. Then we asked a similar split question about safety and asking them, how safe do you feel in your community versus how safe do you feel in Texas cities? The group that was asked about safety in their community generally feels safe, but it's a lot more intense than the group that we asked about Texas cities, where you see a whopping 60% just say somewhat safe. So everyone feels safe, but the feeling, the intensity underlying that varies a lot depending on whether you're talking about your community versus Texas cities. So why is this important? How does this relate to use of force at all? I don't have time to get into what the crime stats say, but you can ask anyone, any expert. We are seeing historic low rates of crime in America and in Texas. So perceptions don't always match reality. And we know that perceptions matter a lot. So with that, I'm going to hard pivot to use of force data. The big takeaways as I kind of speed run data on use of force, we've got national reporting that is very incomplete. We have state level reporting that has a lot of shortcomings. But from that, we can still tell that use of force is a very rare event in police public interactions. We also know from research that use of force has an outsized impact on public perceptions of law enforcement. And then I'm going to, again, go over some of that research that shows promising avenues for reforms. So national reporting, there are two categories of reporting that we get from nation-level use of force research or data collection. One is a survey that's conducted every 2 years that we've been doing since the 90s. That's from the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And then more recently, we have a FBI data collection effort, getting data directly from law enforcement agencies. So I won't spend too long on this. And these slides, I think, are going to be shared with the group, so you can go back and look at these. But in this survey, this once every other year survey, they're asking about police-initiated contacts, resident-initiated contacts, what was the reason for the contacts, and whether those contacts involved force. From the most recent survey that looks at 2022, there's some good news, bad news, I guess. Most residents are reporting that when they initiated the contacts, they were satisfied with the response from law enforcement. The less great news is that 4 out of 10 residents who experienced threat or use of force perceived it as excessive. One of the biggest limitations here, though, aside from it being survey data, which has its own methodological limits, is that there isn't any state-level data. It's hard to get anything granular outside of just the responses to the survey questions. So the FBI is trying to beef this up with data collection directly from law enforcement agencies. This is a voluntary participation data collection program. Nationally, there's decent participation, about 62% of agencies. That covers almost 80% of officers. But Texas, the participation rate is significantly lower. You can see 12% of agencies are participating, and it's just about half of the officers. And we don't get any kind of granular data until we hit a 40% reporting threshold among agencies. So even then, though, the data is not that great. Just to show you what it would look like if we did hit that 40%, this is a table from the national reporting on the reasons for the contact that led to use of force. And most of that 54.3%, is response to unlawful or suspicious activity. There are maybe 3 or 4 other tables that we would get from FBI data. So it doesn't get much more detailed. It's a little better. But for Texas, currently, we don't have any of it because of the participation rate. So state reporting, if we can't rely on the feds, what do we have at the state level? Not much more. I'll briefly, just for the sake of edification, mention that we have the Office of the Attorney General, the OAG's Officer-Involved Injury and Death Reports. It's not too great. You can think about this as a subset of a subset of a subset of use of force incidents. And it collects a handful of elements in these reports. They're collected by the Attorney General, but there's no data work that's done at the Office of the Attorney General. It's not connected to other data sources. So really limited in what you can do with that data. It's an important function, and it has a lot of other important uses, and it's a transparency measure. But for the sake of data and really studying use of force as a phenomenon, it's really limited in what it can do. Motor vehicle stop data, I think, is a lot more interesting. This is collected by the Texas Commission on Law Enforcement from every law enforcement agency every year. They report aggregate data on all the stops that they conduct in the prior year, and it has a lot of good, rich, detailed information. It's got demographic breakdowns of those stops, why those stops happen, whether the stops involved arrests, had contraband that was recovered at the stop, and for our purposes, whether it involved physical force resulting in bodily injury. Another benefit of this data collection effort is that traffic stops are actually the vast majority of police-initiated contacts that we see. So we ran some analysis at Texas 2036 of the past 6 years of data. You've got this maybe predictable dip here. In the pandemic, we were at 9.5 million stops in 2019. And in 2020, that dropped to a little over 6 million. And you've seen in the succeeding years a very slow creep upwards. So we're not at pre-pandemic levels yet. Interested in maybe in the Q&A to hear some of your thoughts. Andrew, when I was talking to him about it, said maybe it has to do with staffing levels, because when staffing levels are low, we're not conducting as many traffic stops. So interested to hear your thoughts there. Here is a visual representation of stops per capita across the state. And you can see there's generally some consistency. In the south of the state, we've got a little bit more in some hotspot counties. And maybe that has to do with border enforcement operations. So importantly, this excludes DPS because that data is just geolocated to Travis County since that's where it's headquartered, and they conduct an insane amount of stops each year. So that would wildly skew this. Doesn't include federal stops either. So we're just looking at local law enforcement by and large. So still, enhanced border operations could be one explanation for what's going on in the southern half of the state. And then to kind of drive the point home about limited data, how rare it is as an event, we've got physical force stops per capita, and you see all the gray there. That is because for all the traffic stops that were conducted in those gray counties, not a single one involved physical force that resulted in injury. And then you've got a couple that have some reporting errors, and that was all that came out of those counties. It's just the reporting error. So that's fun. But here are your top 10 agencies. If we look at physical force stops as a percentage of their total stops, and you see that even among the top 10, it's a pretty infrequent event. You've got Wharton Police Department with close to 6%, or a little bit over 5%, and then after that, it's below 3% of total stops involve physical force. And this is excluding agencies that have less than 50 stops in a given year and excluding those with reporting errors. And I keep talking about reporting errors. And why is that? It is because they are the bane of my existence. So every year, a few agencies will misreport physical force. They'll misreport other things too in their data, but for our purposes, I think this is particularly interesting. So an example here, in 2024, Glasscock County Sheriff's Office reported 2,307 total stops. Of those stops, 2,307 involved physical force. I am not former law enforcement, but I feel pretty confident saying that that's impossible and that no agency would ever report 100% of their stops involving physical force. Again, we're looking at like less than 5% for agencies across the board. So it's not that you've got a bunch of hyper-aggressive folks in Glasscock County Sheriff's Office. It's that you had one person with the wrong number in the wrong cell on a spreadsheet. Still, we can conclude that use of force is rare. So from the national survey, we know that it's like about 2% of residents who experienced a threat of force or non-fatal use of force during any police contact in 2022. And in our analysis of the TCOL motor vehicle stop data, it's about 1% of motor vehicle stops across the board that result in physical force that involve a bodily injury. But important caveat, and this is where I'm going to get into what some of the research says, just because it's rare doesn't mean it's not important. I won't get into the details of these studies. I've actually downloaded them all, and I'm going to send them to Andrew to circulate. So if you want to read these studies, you can get into it. But you've got a couple of studies that show what happens after an improper use of force or perceived improper fatal use of force or high profile use of force. You see that the affected communities, the neighborhoods, they report crimes less frequently. So there was a high profile 2004 case in Milwaukee. After that, one paper found that there was a total net loss of approximately 22,200 calls for service that in the following year. LAPD, another interesting study. Won't get into those details. So policy, what doesn't work? First of all, just to surprise you a little bit, body-worn cameras. If you rewind the clock about 10 years, the policy discussion was body-worn cameras, they're the panacea for police-civilian interaction problems. And while there are important uses for body-worn cameras, and they do good, I'm not going to discount them entirely. When it comes to use of force, there is consistently no measurable effect statistically on whether body-worn camera policies reduce the use of force. Another interesting one, implicit bias training. There's a theory of action where you say maybe implicit bias training because the effects are disproportionate in the aggregate, maybe implicit bias training will have an effect on use of force disparities, and surprisingly, no, it doesn't. A lot of very interesting findings in that study I'd love to talk about more. What are some interesting, promising avenues? So some of the best methodologically sound studies that I've been able to dig up talk about peer injuries and field training officers. So in peer injuries, in Chicago PD, they looked at the random assignment of officers or prospective officers to cadet classes. And if your co-cadet was injured, your likelihood to use force in the following week shoots up 7%. So one thing that this tells us is that improving officer safety and maybe improving mental health supports to officers has an added benefit of reducing use of force. Another interesting study, the field training officers, researchers partnered with Dallas Police Department and kind of using a random assignment of recruits to field training officers, they're able to show essentially that the propensity to use force is inherited from a field training officer to the officers that they train. In other words, the more likely the field training officer was to use force, the more likely their trainee was to use force down the line. So implication is maybe we want to be very selective about who's an FTO so that we're reducing force down the line. Some honorable mentions out there are training. These are some trainings that do work, that do have evidence supporting them. Procedural justice training, which talks to officers about how to be more fair in their interactions with civilians, and then de-escalation training, which is self-explanatory, has really huge effects on not just use of force, but officer injuries. So that is it. Happy to chat more about it, and I'll send Andrew those papers for circulation.
Thank you, Luis, for the excellent data. I look forward to digging into those papers and then circling back around to give you my thoughts. There's some really, really interesting stuff in there. Next, we're going to have Johnny Sutton talk about the evolution of case law as it relates to police use of force.
Thank you, Andrew. It's kind of ironic that I'm talking about case law since I'm known as a trial lawyer. I'm good at talking to juries, but not very good at reading case law. But I can kind of explain from real world experience as a prosecutor. As most of y'all know, I was a state prosecutor for 8 years in the Harris County DA's office in Houston, and then another 8 years as a federal prosecutor and a United States attorney on the federal side in the Western District of Texas and also in Washington, D.C. So most of my career was spent defending cops, having police officers as my star witnesses in cases, but a small percentage of those officers would step over the line and do improper things, shoot people when they shouldn't have, steal stuff, run aliens across the border, doing all kinds of stuff. So I have a lot of experience in prosecuting these folks. But what we're talking about today is use of force. And I'm going to give you just a brief history, and I'm going to talk fast and move fast so we can move on to Andrew. He's got a lot to present as well. But the bottom line is in the old days in the United States, most states had laws that I would basically call fleeing felon at night, which is if a police officer was trying to stop someone who had committed a felony, usually it was a burglary or a murder or a robbery, and if they were fleeing at night, the officer was allowed to use deadly force. And there's a famous case known as Tennessee versus Garner, decided by the Supreme Court in 1985, that analyzed that standard and decided that was not a good standard, that they did a balance under the 14th Amendment and under just kind of new modern reasonable standards, that you couldn't just shoot unarmed people running away from you. You had to have a new standard, which they created in that Garner case. And basically what they said in that case is that shooting somebody using deadly force is a seizure under the Fourth Amendment of the Constitution, and there had to be some kind of reasonableness standard. And that standard was that the officer, a reasonable officer in the position of the officer who did the act, were they under a significant, or did they think they were under a significant threat of imminent bodily injury or death? And if they were, they would be allowed to use deadly force. And then in a second Supreme Court case in 1998, that principle was refined to where the force was, again, from the perspective of the officer at the scene. We're not going to look back 20/20 vision, and now that we know that the suspect was unarmed, which it's what the officer thought at the scene when he was making a split-second decision, often in very tense and uncertain circumstances. What did he do? And that is sort of the benchmark of reasonableness that we use to this day. So, I mean, I guess what I'd say is that is what Andrew's going to talk about, and these are extremely fact-specific situations. I used to teach at Houston Police Department to officers their use of self-defense, and they would always have these questions. Well, what if they're coming at me with a gun? Okay, what if they're coming at me with a knife? What if they're coming at me with a syringe that I know that they say is filled with AIDS-tainted blood? Can I shoot them? Can I kill them? And of course, the answer would always be referred to Chapter 9 of the Penal Code, which defines, that standard we just said. Would a reasonable person in the position of the officer reasonably felt that they were in the danger of having serious bodily injury or death inflicted upon them, they are allowed to use deadly force. But I also would remind the officers that no matter how good your shoot is, no matter how righteous you were in doing it, this is going to be presented to a Harris County grand jury. So you're going to have to explain what you did. So that is kind of the short history there. I'm going to toss it back to Andrew, and then we can probably talk about specific cases later in the discussion if we have time. But Andrew, I'd pass it over to you.
Thank you, Johnny. And you basically gave almost a week's long understanding of very nuanced case law in just 10 minutes. And I really appreciate that. These are very complex issues, and they provide the framework in which we look at all use of force that nowadays we see on TikTok and Instagram and Facebook Reels. And so sort of to take this full circle, what I wanted to do was talk about really some underlying thoughts on interactions with police, because most people don't even understand when the police can arrest you and when they can't. Where does this authority come from? Does this authority, is there such a thing as citizen's arrest? And it's actually located in the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure. Every rookie cop or every cop in the academy learns Article 14 of the CCP, because that's where your authority derives from. And surprisingly, Section A extends that authority to every citizen of Texas. Every person in Texas technically has arrest authority, just like a peace officer. But their arrest authority is somewhat curtailed a little bit in that they can arrest a person, you as a citizen. Now, I don't recommend this. I'm just telling you what the law says. And what it says is that you can arrest a person when you see an offense committed in your view, and that offense is a felony or is a breach of the peace. So what is a breach of the peace? It's actually not just what you think a breach of the peace is. It's clearly defined under Chapter 42 as disorderly conduct and related offenses. So you have things like DOC, which there's a definition for that, riot, obstructing the roadway. These are all the things listed below that qualify as something that just a regular person can arrest another person for. And then, of course, a peace officer has the right to arrest a person for any offense committed in their presence, whether it's a misdemeanor or a felony. With one exception, right, Johnny? This is like a gotcha question, that is speeding. The police are commanded to give you the ability to sign a notice to appear on speeding. And that's the only offense that an officer technically can't take you to jail, take you in front of a magistrate if they observe you committing that offense in their presence. So a officer, albeit it is sometimes outlawed or restricted by their individual policy of their department, technically can arrest a citizen for any offense, littering, jaywalking, anything other than speeding. They could technically, according to the laws of the state of Texas, take you in front of a magistrate if they observe that offense. And then, of course, what force can they use to effect that arrest? This dovetails exactly into that Supreme Court evolution of the 14th Amendment. The use of force has to be objectively reasonable, meaning that it has to sort of pass this three-pronged test. First, based on the totality of the circumstances of everything that was known at the time, not using hindsight, what would a reasonable officer have done in that situation? Not, I used to explain it to the cadets as saying, not TJ Hooker or your favorite TV super cop, like not that guy, and then not Barney Fife, right? Exclude those two archetypes of police officers. It's not your superhero, and it's not your guy who carries his ammunition in his shirt pocket. What would the average Joe cop, the middle of the road guy, what would he have done with the information that he had at the time? And so every time you see a video, you have to think about it through those parameters, not using hindsight. And unfortunately, these days, sometimes we don't judge the use of force using that criteria. So what I want to show you today is a couple of an instance that I thought was super worthy of analysis, and then hopefully we'll have some time to open it up to Q&A. But this is something that happened in Austin just recently. So this hasn't been adjudicated, but a lot of people have seen this incident, and there's some misunderstandings about it, and then there's some pretty clear conclusions that can be drawn from this. But I kind of wanted to walk you step by step through a very complex use of force situation. It's actually a couple of use of forces to give you examples of these principles in action. So this first video, and I'm going to turn the volume off because all you can really hear is crowd noise, and I want to kind of commentate and point some things out as we go. You can't hear any verbal commands from the officers, but I would expect that they would be telling the suspects that they're trying to arrest, show me your hands, stop resisting. Those are what police officers are trained to explain. The other thing too is they're obviously wearing police uniforms, so there's no misunderstanding that these are police officers trying to effect an arrest. And for some background, these officers are responding to a Class C misdemeanor DOC fighting call. Okay, so it's people in public who are fighting. In a public place, it's a breach of the peace, it's DOC fighting, it's an arrestable offense, but remember, it's a Class C misdemeanor. However, just because it starts as a Class C misdemeanor doesn't mean it's always a Class C misdemeanor, because any situation can evolve. If you engage with somebody over a Class C misdemeanor and they start resisting, well, now this incident has taken on a much higher offense. So let's take a look at this video, and I want to point some things out. So first of all, you see this gentleman over here striking the guy on the ground. And a lot of people had issue with that. And just from looking at this one video, you're like, why is this guy, punching this guy? He's on the ground. And the reality is, if you take a step back, you see this other officer who's on the other suspect here. Like this suspect down here is showing his hands, and he's not striking him. So that's a clear example of, like, I'm giving you a command to show me your hands. Because what we're taught as police officers is your hands are the hands are what hurt you, because the hands will go in your drawers and pull out a knife or pull out a gun. It's not uncommon for criminals to secret weapons in their waistband. So if somebody's digging in their pants, I'm particularly concerned. If they're not digging in their pants and they're showing me their hands, my justification for using force is very low. So this officer here is doing a good job of not striking this individual on the ground who's showing him compliance. He then looks over at his buddy and he sees, oh, this guy's having trouble in striking. He must have something over there that's a gun. I'm thinking for him. I don't know. I haven't read his report. I don't know what he really was thinking, but he looks over there and says, okay, that guy's having trouble. I'm going to get up and leave my guy abandon my guy and then help this guy over here, my buddy, who's trying to effect this arrest and unable to. And so they get this guy and they're trying to gain compliance. And while they're doing that, you know, he's rolled over on his belly and he's not showing his hands. So from that perspective, you can look at this and say, you know, those strikes, you know, might be because he's concerned that that guy's going to reach in and grab a weapon. That would be what potentially could be going through his mind. You see in this photo here where the guy is rolled over, not showing his hands, this guy showing his hands. And over here, there's some interesting parts. There's a guy here in this orange shirt that's just hanging out, not doing anything. And there's this young lady right here wearing some cutoff shorts and a brassiere top. And she's aggressively yelling at the officers. And at one point, you see her kind of put water on one of the officers as they're effecting an arrest. So this is another video. And this is the same officer who over here was not striking the individual who was showing his hand. But a few seconds later, you see him walking down, and he just punches this guy in the orange shirt that we saw earlier in the video. So he punches him. The guy falls down. Now, if you notice, the female that we saw in the earlier video, she walks off. She's handcuffed at that time. She was under arrest at that time, and she walks off when he strikes this individual. After he strikes the individual, a couple things happen. One, the officer retreats and doesn't effect an arrest. He punches a guy and then sees him fall down, unconscious, doesn't render first aid, doesn't continue to effect an arrest. In actuality, this officer, I did the screenshot because I can only imagine what's going through this officer's mind right here, having just witnessed what he witnessed and saw that. And he gives this other guy a look that really does tell a lot. So if we continue the video, this video actually ends and it goes out of sequence. And now you go back to this first sequence. So this is the first part where you see the officers effecting the arrest. You see the officer go over and help his buddy. And the reason why I'm showing this again is because at the end of this video, you can see this officer go over, and he's now has this female that you saw in the earlier video. He has her in cuffs, and he's walking her down the pathway. And from this angle, which is a different angle, you see him divert from her, who he has as an arrestee, and then punch the gentleman in the orange shirt. And then that's when the female who was under arrest goes and moves away. The challenge with that, from my perspective as a police officer, is a bunch of things. One, you have somebody under arrest. They're your primary responsibility. You can't deviate from that unless you have a really good reason to do that, because they're your charge. You have, if somebody's handcuffed behind their back, you have total control of them. You can't abandon them in a crowd or leave them. You have to, you're out of commission, so to speak, while you deal with that. So for him to deviate from that and go address another person is very problematic for me. Secondly, to strike an individual and then not continue with an arrest leads me to believe that you didn't really have a reason to use force in the first place. That's just an assumption I have on my part. Secondly, if a person falls like that, you have a duty to give them aid. So that is a situation that I find really problematic. And what I found interesting about this situation is it's the same guy who just earlier is demonstrating appropriate use of force. But in this moment of a minute, he goes from demonstrating appropriate use of force to not appropriate use of force. So that's why I wanted to share this, was to use it as an example of when potentially justifiable use of force, which was the first individual striking the person who was secreting his hands potentially, that looks bad, but is potentially justifiable. And then to also show you that there is use of force that occurs that is very problematic, and here's why. Is that objectively reasonable, right? Would an officer do that? Well, you have 3 other officers right in front of the guy in the orange shirt who did not do that. So the first thing that's going to be demonstrated, if this were to ever be presented to a jury, would be, well, you have 3 other officers and they weren't doing that, so why did you feel like you had to do that? And then from there you can go on with a bunch of what I consider to be a very, very problematic use of force. So that's it for the video part. What I have here as well is, you know, the PC affidavit that was released related to this incident just covers the suspect that was on the ground, that was not complying, but then was eventually arrested. He was charged with assault on a peace officer. The officers allege that he struck an officer while he was trying to do his business with somebody else, and that's what led to them putting him on the ground and arresting him. So that's the only publicly available information that's available about this. And then I also kind of wanted to talk about a little bit, what did this all start over? Like, why were these officers engaging in this activity? And it was because they were responding to a call for service of DOC fighting, which, if anybody's ever been to 6th Street after midnight, it happens Thursday, Friday, Saturday night, 15 times a night, every night. It's just a common occurrence. Whenever you get a mass amount of people down there with alcohol, at closing time, you're always having fisticuffs. And it's a Class C misdemeanor, because as you investigate it, when you pull these 2 people apart, you say, hey, did he hit you and did it hurt? Because then you might have assault with injury, which is a Class A misdemeanor. But invariably they say, no, we just were drunk fighting. I don't want to press charges, which means all you have is DOC fighting, which is a Class C misdemeanor. So now you're looking at this situation where this officer has a tremendous headache. It has brought some severe credibility issues to the department, and it's all over being overzealous, in my opinion, not remembering your training, losing your, however you want to justify it. I mean, it's not appropriate, in my opinion. And so I wanted to bring this to your attention, but also to put it in the context of where these laws come from, where these rules come from, where these precedents come from, and then also have Lewis explain to you that use of force is surprisingly very rare, but that doesn't mean that it's not important. And what can we do to have better data? What can we do to learn from the data that we have to help train and make our police officers the best that they possibly could be? Because we are, I think, as a profession, we are trying to achieve perfection. That's our ultimate goal. Whether perfection is attainable, I think everybody knows the answer to that, but that doesn't mean you stop trying and you stop learning. So with that, I've kind of thrown a tremendous amount of information at you, and I think we have a few minutes left. Does anybody have any questions about this particular use of force or anything that's been covered today? And feel free to type them in the chat or raise your hand or just turn on your camera and be and chime in. You know, you have a wonderful panel of data expertise, law enforcement expertise, and prosecutorial. So if anybody has any questions, I'm happy to field them.
I have a question, Andrew.
Sure, thank you.
So, as someone that served as officer so long ago compared to more recent, what, in your opinion, has been some of the biggest changes as far as the public's perception of similar incidents like you just showed us, and or just in general of the policing profession?
That's a really great question. You know, I started policing in 2000. And back then, the technology didn't exist for the level of transparency that we have today. And so what we saw was that the public got a whole lot of reality, right? And then, of course, with the adoption of the internet and then social media, local incidents that didn't used to become national, now every little thing became national. And so people have the perception, even though the data doesn't support it, that police use of force is a more prevalent issue than statistically it shows to be, because they have access to the data or the incidents more, which puts more responsibility on the police to refine their practices to find that balance between keeping the community safe and prioritizing their resources and prioritizing, quite frankly, their use of force for issues that have public support. The second thing, in all fairness to the police officers, is that there's been a whole lot of transparency without a lot of context. Very few people are familiar with Graham versus Connor or objectively reasonable, or a lot of the rules and the concerns that police officers have for good reason on why they do what they do. And so this lack of context sometimes is the enemy of transparency, because transparency without context can sometimes lead to misunderstandings. In this incident, I think it goes both ways. I think that this transparency, could potentially help one of these officers as they go through public scrutiny. And then for the other one, I think that this transparency may have a positive effect of removing somebody from a profession that maybe they're not suited for. So I think my biggest takeaway from the beginning of my career to the end of my career is that that the technology has really changed the way officers' careers go. One of the things I think, and we'll just kind of wrap it up, again, I want to thank Johnny and Luis and Wandelise and Creighton and everyone that's been involved in this. This has been a really great opportunity to bring forward subject matter experts today, and then in our upcoming meeting, we're going to have some wonderful conversations in Victoria about where law enforcement has been, where it is right now, and where it's going forward. Wandelise, do you have anything that you would like to add or go over before we let everybody go? Again, thank you all for your attention and participation.
Just to say thank you everyone that joined us, and for those that watch us later on the hopefully on the way to the conference, we will see you in Victoria.